Rome conquered half the known world, but never Ireland, and that changed everything. In an age of myth and memory, an island stood apart from the empires of the world. Rome never tamed it, yet its destiny would be shaped by warriors, saints, raiders, and kings. From the druids of the Iron Age to the monks who preserved the light of learning, Ireland became a land of contrasts, where pagan ritual gave way to Christian faith, and where ancient tribes forged a culture that would endure for centuries. But the peace of monasteries could not last. Across the stormy seas came the Vikings, their longships bringing fire and steel, towns burned, treasures stolen, kingdoms tested. Yet from the ashes of destruction rose cities like Dublin, born of both Irish and Norse. Still, Ireland's story was not its own. The shadow of Norman conquest loomed. Castles rose against Gaelic resistance, and centuries of struggle between native kings and foreign lords would follow. From the triumph of Brian Boru at Clontarf to the devastation of Cromwell, Ireland's medieval world was forged in unending conflict and survival. This is not just the tale of invaders and rulers. It is the story of a people, fierce and unyielding, who preserved their spirit through centuries of chaos. This is the saga of medieval Ireland. The history of medieval Ireland cannot be understood without first examining the formative centuries of the Iron Age. This period, stretching from roughly 600 BC to the early Christian era, represents the crucible in which the distinctive elements of Gaelic culture first emerged. It was an age of gradual transformation rather than sudden rupture, where indigenous traditions intertwined with external influences, Celtic, Roman, and perhaps earlier European currents, to form the foundations of Irish society, politics, and identity. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age in Ireland coincided with profound material and cultural changes. Archaeological finds reveal that by the 3rd century BC, the Latin artistic style associated with continental Celtic groups had reached Ireland, particularly in the northern and midland regions. Spiral and trumpet patterns, scabbards, and decorated weapons link Irish elites to the broader Celtic world. Yet as Daibi O'Croinin, an Irish historian and authority on Hiberno-Latin texts, has argued, the process of cultural change was far more complex than a simple wave of invasion. As he notes, rather than imagining Ireland as the passive recipient of some mass Celtic migration, it's better to think in terms of gradual absorption, where indigenous late Bronze Age communities adapted and reshaped continental fashions into their own cultural idioms. This interpretation has gained further weight through genetic research, which suggests continuity in population from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. What shifted most visibly was not the people themselves, but their cultural repertoire, their art, language, and ritual expressions. Thus, Gaelic culture may best be described as the product of fusion, indigenous in origin, but refracted through Celtic influences. One of the most enduring legacies of this period was linguistic. The emergence of the Gaelic branch of Celtic languages in Ireland represents a watershed moment in Irish history. These languages, ancestral to modern Irish, Scots Gaelic, and Manx, became the defining medium of culture and identity. The 17th century recognition that Irish belonged to the Celtic family spurred debates over its origins, but modern linguistics continues to refine the picture. Elva Johnston, a late antique and early medieval Irish historian, has stressed that linguistic evidence points less to a dramatic rupture and more to a gradual alignment of Ireland with the Celtic-speaking world of the Atlantic seaboard, where trade, exchange, and elite networks ensured cultural permeability. Thus, language too was shaped as much by long contact as by colonization. The Irish tongue gave expression to poetry, law, and later Christian theology, but its origins lay deep in this formative age. Society in Iron Age Ireland was structured by a warrior aristocracy, supported by bonds of kinship and stratified hierarchies. The ruling elite combined martial prowess with ritual prestige. Archaeological evidence from hill forts, ring forts, and bog deposits illustrates the martial ethos of the age. The deposition of finely wrought weapons in bogs, such as spears and swords, suggests both religious offerings and the display of elite status. Francis John Byrne was an Irish historian, and his best-known work is Irish Kings and High Kings from 1973. He summarized this society well when he wrote, "The political order of early Ireland was essentially aristocratic, in which a warrior elite dominated through both arms and ancestry, while the learned classes, poets, druids, and jurists preserved and transmitted tradition. This dual structure of arms and learning would persist deep into the medieval era, shaping both the politics and the cultural richness of Gaelic Ireland. By the late Iron Age, the seeds of the kingdoms that would dominate early medieval Ireland had already been planted. Over kingdoms such as Ulaid in the northeast, Maide in the central plains, Laigin in the east, Mumhain in the south, and Connaught in the west trace their origins to this formative period. These were not states in the modern sense, but federations of tuatha, or tribal units, bound by allegiance to powerful dynasties. Political organization was fluid, with kingship both sacral and martial in nature. The king was expected to uphold justice, defend his people, and maintain ritual harmony with the land. Although the Christianization of Ireland in the 5th century would later reshape the concept of kingship. The Iron Age origins of the institution are clear. As Byrne remarks, the concept of kingship in Ireland was never merely military or political, it was deeply symbolic, invested with the well-being of the land and people. Ireland's Iron Age was also defined by its relationship, or more accurately, its distance, from the Roman Empire. Though the island was never conquered, Roman awareness of Ireland was strong. Ptolemy's Geographia, circa 150 AD, lists tribes and locations across Hibernia, showing that trade and communication were real, even if indirect. Tacitus mentions that Agricola, governor of Britain, harboured an exiled Irish prince who might be used to justify intervention. Juvenal likewise alludes to Roman arms reaching beyond the shores of Ireland. Robert Bartlett, professor of medieval history at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, has noted Ireland presents one of the great counterfactuals of European history. Here was an island within reach of Rome, yet it remained outside imperial frontiers, a frontier space where Roman goods arrived, but Roman law and legions did not. This status allowed Ireland to develop independently, while still absorbing Mediterranean influences through trade and contact. Roman coins, glassware, and pottery found in Irish contexts testify to exchange, but Ireland remained politically autonomous. The late Roman period saw increasing movement between Ireland and Britain. Irish raiders, known as Scotti, attacked Roman Britain in the 4th century, contributing to the instability of the frontier. Some Irish groups, most notably the Dalriata, crossed the sea permanently, settling in western Scotland and forging a transmarine kingdom that would become pivotal in later centuries. These movements illustrate the fluidity of the Irish Sea as a cultural zone. As historian Daibi O'Croinin observes, the Irish Sea was not a boundary but a bridge, linking communities in Ireland, Britain and beyond into a single network of trade, piracy and settlement. Thus, the Iron Age Irish were not isolated. They were active participants in the world of late antiquity, exploiting opportunities in both raiding and settlement. Religion in Iron Age Ireland remains elusive, but archaeological and classical sources allow partial reconstruction. Polytheistic practices centered on nature, sacred groves, rivers and bogs. The deposition of offerings in watery contexts suggests belief in divine forces inhabiting the landscape. Druids, learned specialists in ritual lore and law, likely played a key role in maintaining spiritual authority. Although much about Druidic practice is obscured by later Christian writers, their cultural memory endured in Irish tradition. Druids symbolized the pre-Christian learned elite, whose authority would later be paralleled by Christian monks. Elva Johnston notes, the continuity between Druidic authority and the prestige of later Christian literati lies not in theology, but in the social role of the learned class, mediating between rulers, tradition, and the supernatural. This cultural role of intellectual elites set the stage for Ireland's later transformation into a land of monasteries and scholars. By the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the contours of medieval Ireland were already visible. Linguistic, political, and cultural frameworks had taken shape. The emergence of dynastic kingdoms, the warrior aristocracy, the prestige of learned classes, and Ireland's maritime networks with Britain and Europe all foreshadowed the developments of the early Christian era. As O'Croinin concludes, when written history first illuminates Ireland in the 5th century, it reveals not a society emerging from barbarism, but a complex culture already rich in institutions, traditions, and identity, prepared to enter the Christian and medieval worlds on its own terms. The Iron Age in Ireland was less an age of abrupt conquest than of continuity and synthesis. Celtic art and language were adopted and transformed by local populations. Kingdoms and dynasties began to crystallize, embedding social hierarchies that would endure for centuries. Though untouched by Roman legions, Ireland was not untouched by Roman influence, and through trade and piracy, its people actively engaged with the wider world. By the eve of the Christian era, Ireland possessed the essential cultural elements: language, kingship, aristocratic warrior society, and intellectual elites that would define its medieval history. The island stood ready for the profound transformation that the arrival of Christianity would bring. The arrival of Christianity in Ireland and the subsequent flourishing of its monastic culture represent one of the most transformative epochs in Irish history. Between the 5th and 8th centuries, the island underwent profound changes that redefined its political, social, and cultural trajectory. The pagan aristocratic world of druids and tribal kings was gradually reshaped into a Christian society structured around dynastic kingship, ecclesiastical authority, and a remarkable intellectual tradition, far from being a passive recipient of outside influence. Peter Brown is an Irish historian. He is the Rollins Professor of History Emeritus at Princeton University. Brown is credited with having brought coherence to the field of late antiquity and is often regarded as the inventor of said field. In his book, The Rise of Western Christendom, from 2013, he notes, "A frontier society that turned its isolation into an advantage, producing a Christian culture whose originality and dynamism shaped the wider Western world." The first attempts to establish Christianity in Ireland were made in the early 5th century. Prosper of Aquitaine records that in 431 AD, Pope Celestine sent Palladius as the first bishop to the Irish who believed in Christ. This small but significant reference demonstrates that there were already Christian communities in Ireland before the arrival of the more famous missionary, Patrick. Thomas Charles Edwards is an emeritus academic at the University of Oxford. He formerly held the post of Jesus Professor of Celtic and is a professorial fellow at Jesus College. He emphasizes that Palladius was primarily appointed as a bishop to serve existing Irish Christians, particularly in Leinster and Meath, rather than to convert pagans. As Charles Edwards explains, the mission of Palladius is proof that Christianity had already found adherents in Ireland. His role was less to bring a new faith than to organize and strengthen what had already taken root. Patrick's mission, in contrast, was directed toward conversion on a broader scale. His Confessio, the earliest surviving Irish text, written in Latin, reveals both the struggles and the convictions of a man deeply engaged in the task of preaching to non-Christians. Patrick describes himself as a sinner most unlearned, the least of all the faithful, yet he testifies to baptizing thousands and ordaining clergy. His activity focused particularly in Ulster and Connaught, regions less touched by Palladius. O'Croinin cautions, however, against taking later hagiographical traditions at face value. He observes, much of the Patrick known to later ages is the creation of centuries of myth-making. The historical Patrick remains elusive. A Romano-British bishop working with limited resources, remembered more for the myth that grew around him than for the actual scale of his achievements. Nonetheless, the combined efforts of Palladius, Patrick, and unnamed early missionaries marked the beginning of Ireland's slow but decisive shift from a pagan to a Christian society. Conversion was not uniform or immediate. Different regions embraced Christianity at different paces, often mediated by dynastic politics. Kings played a central role as their conversion carried symbolic and practical weight for their subjects. Elva Johnston emphasizes the social complexity of this process. Conversion in Ireland was not a single moment, nor was it the triumph of one man's mission. It was a protracted, regionally diverse phenomenon in which political allegiance, kinship structures, and the prestige of literacy all played vital roles. Kingship itself was reshaped in Christian terms. The sacral elements of pagan kingship were gradually replaced or reinterpreted within a Christian framework. The king was now seen not only as a war leader and lawgiver, but also as a protector of the church. Some dynasties, such as the Uí Néill in the north, used their patronage of the church to reinforce their political dominance, binding the sacred and the secular into a mutually reinforcing system. If the 5th century was an age of conversion, the 6th and 7th centuries were the age of monasticism. Monasteries quickly became the dominant institutions of Irish Christianity, eclipsing the role of diocesan bishops in many regions. These foundations were not merely religious communities, but multifaceted centres of learning, art, and economic power. Kathleen Hughes observes, the Irish church developed a distinctive monastic character. The monastery was not simply a place of prayer and ascetic withdrawal. It was the nucleus of local society, a centre of literacy, a focus of political patronage, and a school in which generations of the elite were educated. Famous monasteries such as Clonmacnoise, founded in the mid-6th century along the River Shannon, became hubs of both spiritual devotion and secular authority. Iona, established by Columba in 563, would become a bridge between Ireland and Scotland, profoundly influencing the conversion of Pictish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Glendalough, associated with St. Kevin, blended ascetic retreat with cultural vitality. These monasteries were closely tied to kinship networks. Dynasties often founded monasteries to consolidate their authority, installing abbots from within their families. In this way, monasticism and dynastic politics became inseparably intertwined. Ireland's monastic culture produced a flowering of scholarship and art unparalleled in the post-Roman West. The introduction of the Roman alphabet enabled the recording of both Latin and vernacular Irish texts. Brehon laws, sagas, genealogies, and poetry that had long circulated orally were increasingly preserved in writing. Daibi o Croinin highlights the originality of this intellectual synthesis. The Irish created a hybrid literary culture in which classical Latin learning coexisted with native traditions. This was not passive borrowing but active reinterpretation, a process that gave Ireland a distinctive voice in early medieval Europe. Illuminated manuscripts such as the Book of Durrow circa 650 and the Book of Kells circa 800 testify to the sophistication of insular art. The fusion of Celtic spirals, Christian iconography, and geometric precision created a style that would influence Romanesque and Gothic art across Europe. Metalwork masterpieces such as the Ardagh chalice and stone monuments like the high crosses of Monasterboice further illustrate the creativity of this age. Far from being isolated, Ireland became an exporter of missionaries and scholars to Britain and the continent. Figures such as Columba, Columbanus, and Aidan of Lindisfarne carried Irish monastic ideals abroad, founding communities that shaped the spiritual and cultural landscapes of Europe. Peter Brown places this in broader perspective. The Irish, whose island had lain beyond the reach of Rome, became in the centuries after Patrick the shock troops of Christian expansion. Their monasteries scattered across the western seas and the continent carried with them a vitality and originality unmatched in the Latin West. England in particular benefited from Irish influence. The Synod of Whitby, 664, illustrates the interaction and eventual tension between Irish and Roman traditions, particularly in the calculation of Easter. While Roman practice ultimately prevailed in Northumbria, the prestige of Irish scholarship remained high. English students studied in Irish monasteries, and the Venerable Bede acknowledged Ireland's generosity in welcoming Anglo-Saxon exiles. The flourishing of Irish culture was not without setbacks. The plagues of the 660s and 680s had devastating consequences. Contemporary annals record widespread mortality, affecting kings, clerics, and commoners alike. Francis John Byrne captured the cultural rupture. The plagues of the 660s and the 680s had a traumatic effect on Irish society. The golden age of the saints was over, together with the generation of kings who could fire a saga writer's imagination. Antiquaries, brehons, genealogists, and hagiographers felt the need to collect ancient traditions before they were totally forgotten. Many were in fact swallowed by oblivion. This sense of cultural loss spurred a renewed effort to preserve traditions in writing. As oral memory faltered, manuscripts became the guardians of history, law, and myth. By the end of the 8th century, Ireland had firmly established itself as a Christian and monastic society, deeply interconnected with the wider world. Its kingships had adapted to Christian frameworks, its monasteries had become engines of culture and politics, and its scholars had secured a place for Ireland in the intellectual life of Europe. Yet the very wealth and prominence of these monasteries made them targets. In 795, the first recorded Viking raid struck the monastery of Lambay Island, heralding a new era of upheaval. As O'Croinin concludes, the centuries from Patrick to the Vikings represent Ireland's true golden age, when its isolation was turned into strength and its cultural originality made it the beacon of Christian learning in early medieval Europe. The Christianization of Ireland and the rise of its monastic culture between 400 and 795 laid the foundations for all subsequent Irish history. Through conversion, kingship was redefined. Through monasteries, learning and art flourished. Through missionaries, Ireland reshaped Europe. The trauma of the plagues underscored the fragility of human society, but also spurred the preservation of tradition. By the close of this period, Ireland had become both profoundly local, rooted in kinship and landscape, and profoundly universal, integrated into the Christian world. This paradox of a small island with global influence would remain a defining feature of its history. The period from the late 8th century to the 12th was marked by the arrival and settlement of Viking groups in Ireland, a development that profoundly transformed the island's political and cultural landscape. Long depicted as a destructive force, the Vikings were also agents of change, introducing new forms of warfare, trade, and urban life. The centuries between the first raid in 795 and the Anglo-Norman Invasion of 1169 reveal a dynamic interplay between Norse newcomers and Gaelic society, producing both conflict and creative synthesis. The annals of Ulster record that in the year 795, the burning of Recru by the heathens took place, referring to the monastery on Lambay Island, north of Dublin. This marks the first known Viking attack on Irish soil. In the decades that followed, monasteries across the coasts of Ireland became targets, their wealth in books, shrines and enslaved captives proving irresistible to raiders. As Dyby O'Croinin observes, the earliest phase of Viking activity in Ireland was characterised by lightning strikes against monasteries and coastal settlements. The violence of these attacks, falling upon the cultural heart of Christian Ireland, has left a disproportionate impression of unmitigated destruction. These raids were part of a wider pattern across the British Isles, as monasteries in Lindisfarne, 793, and Iona, 802, also fell victim. Yet Ireland's dense network of monastic centres made it particularly vulnerable to Viking depredations. By the 830s and 840s, Viking activity had shifted from hit-and-run raids to the establishment of semi-permanent bases known as long forts. These riverine encampments allowed raiders to overwinter in Ireland and launch attacks deeper into the interior. The foundation of Dublin around 841 represented a decisive step. Within a generation, it evolved from a long fort into a fortified town, the first true urban centre in Irish history. Other settlements followed at Waterford, Limerick, Wexford and Cork. Sion Duffy specialises in the history of medieval Ireland. He highlights the significance of this transition. The Vikings brought with them the idea of the town, something utterly novel in Ireland. Dublin, Limerick and Waterford were not only bases for raiding but also commercial entrepôts, linking Ireland into the long-distance trade networks of the Viking world. Here lay one of the greatest paradoxes of the Viking Age in Ireland. While they disrupted monastic life through violent raids, they simultaneously laid the foundations for Ireland's first cities. Over time, Viking settlers intermarried and integrated with local Irish dynasties, producing a hybrid Norse Gaelic culture. The Gael, literally foreign Gaels, embodied this fusion, adopting both Irish language and Norse customs. Claire Downham emphasises the fluidity of these identities. The boundary between Viking and Irish was never rigid. Alliances, fosterage, and intermarriage created overlapping identities, and the sons of Irish kings might command Viking fleets just as Norse leaders might adopt Gaelic titles. The political landscape of Ireland was reshaped by these shifting alliances. Vikings were as likely to fight alongside one Irish dynasty as against another. This pattern of opportunistic warfare made them both a destabilizing and a stabilizing force, depending on circumstance. The establishment of Viking towns transformed the Irish economy. Archaeological evidence from Dublin reveals a bustling market where goods from Scandinavia, the British Isles, and even the Islamic world circulated. Amber, walrus ivory, and silks from the east met with Irish wool, hides, and slaves. Coinage, too, was introduced, with the first minting of coins in Dublin in 997 under King Sitric Silkbeard. This marked Ireland's entry into a monetary economy, supplementing the traditional exchange of cattle and goods. Robert Bartlett situates this development within broader European patterns. The Viking towns of Ireland were nodal points in a commercial revolution that extended from Baghdad to the North Atlantic. Ireland, once a peripheral island, was drawn into this network, its ports becoming gateways to the wider world. The darker side of this economy was slavery. Irish captives, often taken during Viking raids, were traded through Dublin into wider markets. Although the practice predated the Vikings, their towns intensified and systematized the trade. The most famous clash of the Viking Age in Ireland occurred in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf. Brian Boru, High King of Ireland from the Dalkais dynasty, confronted a coalition of Dublin Norse, Leinster rebels, and Viking contingents from overseas. Although Brian was killed in the battle, his forces claimed victory, breaking the military power of Dublin's Vikings. Yet the battle's significance has been debated. Francis John Byrne cautions, Clontarf was not a simple victory of Christian Irish over pagan foreigners. It was, rather, a complex struggle in which Irish factions allied with Norse groups on both sides. Its legacy lies less in the elimination of the Vikings than in the elevation of Brian's dynasty and the reshaping of the Irish kingship. Nevertheless, Clontarf became a powerful symbol of Irish resistance, celebrated in later tradition as the triumph of Ireland's unity over foreign invaders. Despite Clontarf, Norse Dublin continued to flourish as a political and economic centre. Sitric Silkbeard reigned for nearly 50 years, overseeing both the minting of coins and the foundation of Christ Church Cathedral. The city remained a focal point of Irish-Scandinavian exchange, its rulers balancing allegiance to both Gaelic kings and Norse patrons abroad. Janet Nelson, also known as Ginty Nelson, was a British historian and professor of medieval history at King's College London. Regarding those events, she notes, "The durability of Dublin as a Norse kingdom demonstrates that the Vikings were not transient raiders, but rooted actors in Irish politics. Their legacy was institutional as much as martial. By the 11th century, Dublin was no longer an alien imposition, but an integral, if contested, part of the Irish political landscape. Ireland's role in the Viking world extended beyond its shores. Norse fleets from Dublin raided Wales and Western England, while Irish kings forged alliances with Norse rulers in the Isles and Norway. The marriage alliance between Muirchertach Ua Briain of Munster and Magnus Barefoot of Norway in the early 12th century illustrates the continuing entanglement of Irish and Norse dynasties. As Claire Downham explains, the Irish Sea Zone was a single arena of interaction, where Norse and Gaelic polities competed and collaborated. The political map of Ireland cannot be understood in isolation from Scotland, the Isles, and even Norway. This interconnectedness reinforced Ireland's role as both a battleground and a bridge between cultures. By the 12th century, Viking power in Ireland had waned, but their towns endured. Dublin, Waterford and Limerick remained vibrant urban centres, and their economic and cultural contributions could not be undone. Yet the political landscape was shifting once more. The rise of powerful Irish overkings, such as Tuathailbeach Ua Conchobar and his son Ruaidhri, reflected attempts to centralise authority and control the towns founded by Norse settlers. Sean Duffy captures this transition. The Vikings never conquered Ireland, but they changed it irrevocably. They introduced the town, monetized the economy, and reshaped the Irish sea world. When the Normans came in the late 12th century, they did not land on a timeless Gaelic shore, but on one already transformed by 3 centuries of Norse presence. Thus, the Viking Age in Ireland closed not with their disappearance, but with their absorption into the fabric of Irish life, leaving behind institutions that would outlast them. The Viking centuries in Ireland, 795 to 1169, were a time of conflict, transformation, and synthesis. From the burning of monasteries to the building of towns, from raiding to trading, from enemies to allies, the Vikings shaped the course of Irish history in profound ways. Christian Ireland suffered grievously from their attacks, yet it also adapted and grew stronger. The towns, founded by Norse settlers, created new economic and political possibilities, embedding Ireland in global networks. The fusion of Norse and Gaelic traditions enriched both cultures. As Daibi O'Croinin reflects, the Viking impact on Ireland was neither wholly destructive nor wholly creative. It was, rather, a dialectic of violence and integration, whose outcome was the emergence of a more complex and connected Ireland. By the time of the Anglo-Norman Invasion, Ireland was no longer the land of druids and isolated monasteries. It was a society of kings and towns, Gaelic and Norse, poised on the threshold of yet another transformation. The arrival of the Anglo-Normans in Ireland during the late 12th century represents one of the great turning points in the island's history. For centuries, Ireland had remained politically fragmented, yet culturally vibrant, shaped by Gaelic traditions and the Norse legacy of towns and trade. The invasion of 1169 to 1171 brought Ireland decisively into the orbit of European feudal politics and the expanding ambitions of the English crown. It introduced new forms of warfare, architecture, and governance, while profoundly destabilizing the balance of power among Irish kings. From the landing of the first Norman mercenaries to the consolidation of royal authority under King John, the period between 1169 and 1261 marked a century of conquest, resistance, and transformation. By the mid-12th century, Ireland was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, while ambitious overkings such as Tuadelbach ua Conchobert and his son Ruaidri ua Conchobert had sought to impose a high kingship with real authority, their power remained contested. Dynastic rivalries and shifting alliances made political unity elusive. In this context, the figure of Diarmait mac Murchada, King of Leinster, played a decisive role. Deposed in 1166 by the High King Ruaidri, Diarmait fled overseas to seek allies. He found them not in Ireland, but in England, where the recently crowned Henry II authorised him to recruit Norman and Welsh lords to aid his return. Marie-Therese Flanagan is Professor Emerita of Medieval History at Queen's University Belfast. She explains, the exile of Diarmait mac Murchada provided the spark for the Norman intervention. By seeking aid across the Irish Sea, he transformed a local dynastic struggle into a moment of continental significance. In 1169, a force of Anglo-Norman knights, Flemings, and Welsh archers landed in Wexford. Led by Robert Fitzstephen and Maurice Fitzgerald, they swiftly captured towns and reinstated Diarmait as King of Leinster. Their disciplined cavalry and heavy armour proved devastating against Irish forces unaccustomed to such tactics. The following year, Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, arrived with a larger contingent. Strongbow married Diarmait's daughter Oif, securing his claim as heir to Leinster. With this alliance, what had begun as a mercenary intervention became a major political reconfiguration. David Bates situates Strongbow's actions within a broader pattern. The Norman presence in Ireland must be seen not as an isolated episode, but as part of the wider movement of expansion that carried Norman arms from Sicily to Scotland. Ireland was one more frontier of a restless and militarized aristocracy. Strongbow's success alarmed both the Irish High King and Henry II, who feared the creation of a rival Norman principality on his western flank. In 1171, Henry II crossed the Irish Sea with a formidable fleet, landing at Waterford and proceeding to Dublin. He became the first king of England to set foot in Ireland. His arrival served two purposes: to assert his overlordship over the Norman adventurers and to secure papal sanction for English authority in Ireland. The papal bull Laudabilita, issued by Adrian IV in the 1150s, had granted Henry permission to intervene in Ireland to reform its church and align it with Roman practices. While the authenticity and interpretation of the bull have been debated, it provided useful ideological cover. Robert Bartlett emphasizes the symbolic nature of Henry's expedition. The entry of Henry II into Ireland was less a conquest than a demonstration of authority. By accepting the submission of Irish kings and Norman lords alike, he transformed a chaotic invasion into the foundation of the lordship of Ireland. Henry created the title Dominus Hiberniae, Lord of Ireland, for his youngest son, John. When John later succeeded to the English throne, the lordship was absorbed into the English crown, embedding Ireland permanently into the Angevin polity. Irish kings responded to the Norman intrusion with a mixture of resistance and negotiation. Raedri Ua Conchobar attempted to rally opposition, but was forced into the Treaty of Windsor in 1175, recognizing Henry II's overlordship in return for control of the rest of Ireland outside the Norman enclaves. Yet the treaty was fragile. Norman settlers expanded their territories beyond royal grants, pressing deeper into Munster and Connaught. Castles sprang up across the landscape, symbols of military dominance and administrative control. Robin Frame is a graduate of Trinity College, Dublin and Emeritus, Professor of History at Durham University. He has noted, "The castle was the physical manifestation of the new order. It was both fortress and administrative centre, projecting Norman power in stone and mortar." Some Gaelic rulers forged alliances with Norman lords, marrying daughters into their families or employing their military skills in local conflicts. Others resisted bitterly, leading to cycles of rebellion and repression. The Anglo-Norman Invasion introduced profound social and cultural changes. The feudal system of landholding, with its emphasis on written charters and tenurial obligations, contrasted sharply with the Gaelic emphasis on kinship and customary law. The introduction of parishes and diocesan structures, reinforced by the reforms of the Irish Church at the Synods of Cashel, 1172, and later Rathbraesale, aligned Irish Christianity more closely with continental norms. Sean Duffy explains, the Anglo-Norman settlement in Ireland was not simply a military conquest. It represented the transplantation of an entire cultural system, feudal law, ecclesiastical reform, and urban development that reshaped the island's institutions. Urban life expanded as the Normans developed existing Viking towns, such as Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, into chartered boroughs with markets and trade privileges. Merchants from Bristol and beyond flocked to these centres, connecting Ireland more firmly to England and continental Europe. Despite the initial Norman successes, the 13th century witnessed a Gaelic resurgence. Local Irish dynasties adapted to the new realities, learning to fight with cavalry, constructing stone fortifications, and exploiting Norman divisions. The Battle of Callan in 1261 symbolised this revival. Finian MacCarthy of Desmond defeated a Norman army, halting further Norman expansion in Munster. Dibio Croinin remarks, by the mid-13th century, the momentum of conquest had stalled. The Normans controlled much of the fertile east and south, but Gaelic lords had not only survived, they had adapted and, in many cases, thrived. The failure to complete the conquest left Ireland divided, a colonial east dominated by Norman settlers and a resilient Gaelic west and north. This duality would persist for centuries. The Anglo-Norman Invasion of 1169 to 1171 and its aftermath between 1171 and 1261 marked the beginning of a new era in Irish history. What started as the exile-driven appeal of Diarmait Mac Machada became a full-scale political transformation. Henry II's intervention ensured that Ireland would be tied to the English crown, inaugurating centuries of contested lordship. The Normans brought with them castles, towns, and feudal institutions that altered the Irish landscape. Yet Gaelic society proved remarkably resilient, adapting to and at times reversing the momentum of conquest. As Robert Bartlett has aptly summarised, Ireland in the 12th and 13th centuries was not simply conquered, it was transformed into a frontier society where Gaelic and Norman, tradition and innovation clashed and coexisted in complex and enduring ways. The Anglo-Norman Invasion thus reshaped Ireland without erasing it. The synthesis and conflict that followed would define Irish history for the remainder of the Middle Ages. The mid-13th century marked a decisive shift in the history of Ireland. The initial vigour of Anglo-Norman conquest, which had swept across Leinster, Munster and much of Connaught in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, faltered. In its place arose a powerful Gaelic resurgence, as native lords reasserted their authority and adapted effectively to the military and political strategies of their conquerors. Between the Battle of Callan in 1261 and the close of the 15th century, the Anglo-Norman colony contracted, beset by internal rivalries, demographic catastrophe, and the resilience of Gaelic lordship. What emerged was not the eradication of English power, but its reduction to a fragmented, defensive enclave, the Pale around Dublin. The Gaelic revival is often symbolised by the Battle of Callan in 1261, where Fineen MacCarthy of Desmond inflicted a devastating defeat on the forces of John Fitzgerald. This victory halted further Norman expansion in Munster and re-established the MacCarthys as dominant in the south. As Sian Duffy explains, the Battle of Callan was more than a military clash. It represented the end of the period of unstoppable Anglo-Norman advance. Thereafter, Gaelic lords would not merely survive, but would increasingly push back against a weakened colony, Ireland, in the Middle Ages, 1997. The defeat of Norman forces at Callan exposed the fragility of conquest. It also marked the beginning of a shift from expansion to consolidation for the Anglo-Norman settlers. The resurgence of Gaelic power was not achieved by reverting to old traditions alone. Gaelic lords adapted to Norman innovations, incorporating heavy cavalry, stone fortifications, and more centralised forms of lordship. The O'Neills in Ulster, the O'Donnells in Donegal, and the O'Briens in Thomond exemplified this adaptive resilience. Catherine Sims has highlighted this pragmatic flexibility. The native Irish did not simply resist Norman influence. They absorbed and redeployed its military techniques. By the 14th century, Irish armies rode as cavalry, built stone castles, and employed professional soldiers galaglas in ways that matched and sometimes surpassed their Norman rivals. The galaglas, mercenary warriors of Norse-Scottish descent, became a defining feature of Gaelic warfare, hired by Irish kings to bolster their forces. Their presence reflects the transnational networks of the Irish Sea, where Gaelic, Norse, and Scottish elements blended. The arrival of the Black Death in 1348 had a profound impact on Ireland, particularly among the Anglo-Norman population concentrated in towns. Mortality was severe, depopulating urban centres and weakening the economic base of the colony. Gaelic society, more dispersed and rural, was less affected, though not immune. Robin Frame describes the consequences starkly. The Black Death struck at the heart of the colonial establishment. Its towns and settlements, with their denser populations and greater reliance on trade, were devastated. Gaelic society, rooted in dispersed rural networks, suffered less catastrophic losses and emerged relatively stronger in the balance of power. In the aftermath, many Norman settlers abandoned their estates or intermarried with the Irish, accelerating a process of cultural assimilation often described as Gaelicization. By the 14th and 15th centuries, many Anglo-Norman families had become, in the words of a later proverb, more Irish than the Irish themselves. They adopted Gaelic language, law, dress, and patronage of poets and bards. The Burkes of Connaught, the Butlers of Ormond, and the Fitzgeralds of Desmond and Kildare exemplified this cultural fusion. Brendan Smith is Professor of Medieval History. He notes, regarding those events, the phenomenon of Gaelicization was not merely a matter of cultural borrowing, but of identity transformation. Norman lords, once the vanguard of conquest, now sponsored Irish poets, enforced Irish law, and saw themselves as Gaelic princes in all but ancestry. This process blurred the distinction between conqueror and conquered, creating a hybrid society in much of Ireland beyond the Pale. The collapse of English authority outside the core regions culminated in the contraction of direct control to the area around Dublin, known as the Pale. By the 15th century, the Pale consisted of a fortified strip of land encompassing Dublin, parts of Meath, Kildare and Louth. Beyond this zone, English law and administration had little reach. Robert Bartlett emphasises the symbolic weight of this contraction. The reduction of English power to the Pale epitomised the failure of conquest. What had begun as a colonial project of expansion was now reduced to a defensive enclave, its rulers hemmed in by resurgent Gaelic lords. Within the Pale, English customs, language and law were maintained, but constant raids from Gaelic neighbours forced the construction of fortifications and ditches. The contrast between the Pale and the surrounding Gaelic world reinforced the sense of colonial isolation. Among the Anglo-Norman families, the Fitzgerald Earls of Kildare rose to preeminence during this period. By combining military strength with astute alliances with Gaelic lords, they effectively ruled Ireland on behalf of the English crown while pursuing their own dynastic interests. Daibeo Croinin explains their dominance. By the late 15th century, the Fitzgerald Earls of Kildare were the de facto rulers of Ireland. Their power rested on a delicate balance, loyalty to the English crown on one hand and deep integration into Gaelic society on the other. The Fitzgeralds embody the ambiguities of the period, simultaneously Norman and Irish, loyal subjects and independent magnates. Despite the turbulence of war and shifting power, the later Middle Ages in Ireland witnessed remarkable cultural vitality under Gaelic lordship. Poets, historians and lawyers found patronage among Irish kings and Norman lords alike. The bardic schools preserved and developed the literary tradition, producing works in classical Irish that celebrated dynastic genealogies and heroic ideals. Catherine Sims underscores the centrality of this cultural world. In Gaelic Ireland, the poet was not a marginal figure, but the custodian of memory and legitimacy. The revival of Gaelic lordship in the 14th and 15th centuries was accompanied by a flowering of bardic culture that reinforced the identity and resilience of the Gaelic polity. This cultural renaissance illustrates that the decline of English power did not mean cultural decline, but rather the reassertion of Gaelic values and traditions. Events in England further weakened colonial authority. The Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1487, diverted royal attention and resources away from Ireland. The Dublin administration was left underfunded and dependent on local magnates such as the Fitzgeralds. As Sian Duffy notes, the English crown's capacity to project power into Ireland was drastically reduced in the 15th century. The Pale survived less because of royal strength than because of local lords who maintained a fragile balance between Gaelic neighbours and English identity. Thus, Ireland drifted further from effective English governance, becoming a land of semi-independent lordships. The period from 1261 to 1500 witnessed the collapse of Norman expansion and the remarkable resurgence of Gaelic power. What had seemed in the 12th century to be the beginning of permanent conquest became, by the 15th century, a story of decline, assimilation and survival. The Black Death, Gaelic adaptation and English neglect all contributed to the shrinking of colonial authority. The Pale, with its fortified boundary, symbolised the limits of conquest. Meanwhile, Gaelic lords not only re-established their dominance, but fostered a cultural flowering that reinforced their legitimacy. As Robin Frame concludes, by the close of the Middle Ages, Ireland was no longer a land of conquest, but a land of accommodation and hybridity. The Normans had not been expelled, but they had ceased to be conquerors. The society that emerged was one in which Gaelic and Anglo-Norman traditions fused, creating the distinctive world of late medieval Ireland. The resurgence of Gaelic lordship and the decline of Norman authority set the stage for the next great chapter in Irish history, the Tudor conquest of the 16th century, when England would once again seek to impose its will upon the island with greater determination and brutality. The 16th century marked the most decisive turning point in the history of medieval and early modern Ireland. The rise of the Tudor monarchy in England, with its determination to extend centralised authority across its territories, ended the relative autonomy of Irish lords and Anglo-Norman magnates alike. What had for centuries been a patchwork of Gaelic kingdoms, Anglo-Norman lordships, and the semi-isolated Pale around Dublin was, over the course of 7 decades, brought under tighter English control. The process was violent, prolonged, and contested, culminating in the destruction of many Gaelic dynasties, the suppression of Catholic resistance, and the imposition of new administrative structures that bound Ireland to the English crown. The Tudor conquest began in earnest in the 1530s with the collapse of the Fitzgerald Earls of Kildare, long the most powerful family in Ireland. The rebellion of Silken Thomas in 1534 against Henry VIII's rule provided the crown with an opportunity to dismantle the dominance of the Geraldines. As Stephen G. Ellis, Irish historian from University of Galway, remarks, the destruction of the Kildare Earls represented a watershed. For centuries, the Fitzgeralds had acted as kingmakers and quasi-independent rulers in Ireland. Their fall opened the way for direct Tudor intervention, and the beginnings of the Reconquest. Henry VIII seized this chance to assert greater control. In 1541, the Irish Parliament declared him King of Ireland, replacing the earlier title of Lord of Ireland. This symbolic change reflected a new political reality, the assertion that the island was a kingdom in its own right, directly subject to the Tudor monarchy. The new Kingdom of Ireland coincided with the English Reformation. Henry VIII's break with Rome reverberated across Ireland, where the vast majority of the population remained loyal to Catholic practice. Brendan Bradshaw, a university lecturer in history and a fellow of Queen's College, Cambridge, stresses the difficulty of this transformation. The Reformation in Ireland was, in essence, a political act rather than a religious movement. While in England reform was driven by ideological and theological currents, in Ireland it was imposed from above and met with profound resistance. Monasteries, long the pillars of Irish cultural life, were suppressed, their lands confiscated and redistributed to English officials and settlers. This marked not only an economic but a symbolic rupture with the medieval past, as many of Ireland's most significant religious institutions were dissolved or left in ruins. Irish lords responded variously to Tudor initiatives. Some sought accommodation with the crown, accepting English titles and recognizing royal authority in return for protection and lands. The policy of surrender and re-grant aimed to integrate Gaelic and Old English elites into the Tudor framework by converting them into peers of the realm. Yet many resisted, clinging to their ancestral customs, Catholic faith, and independence. Ciaran Brady underlines the contradictions of Tudor policy. The crown aimed simultaneously at integration and domination. While offering Irish lords a place within the structures of English nobility, it never ceased to undermine their autonomy through plantation, confiscation, and military intervention. This ambivalence produced cycles of rebellion and repression, with violence becoming increasingly brutal as the 16th century progressed. The reign of Elizabeth I witnessed the most intense phase of Tudor conquest. Rebellions in Munster during the 1560s and 1570s were suppressed with ferocity, culminating in the Desmond Rebellions, 1569–73 and 1579–83. These campaigns devastated Munster, with scorched earth tactics leading to famine and depopulation. Jane Ohlmeyer emphasizes their significance. The Desmond Rebellions marked the beginning of the end for the great magnates of southern Ireland. Their suppression not only destroyed the power of the Geraldines of Munster, but also opened the way for the first systematic plantation of English settlers on a large scale. The Munster plantation introduced new Protestant landholders, though it initially struggled to take root. Yet it foreshadowed the later Ulster plantation, which would permanently alter the demographic balance of the island. The climax of Tudor conquest came with the 9 Years' War, the most formidable Gaelic resistance to English rule, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and his ally Hugh Roe O'Donnell. The Gaelic lords of Ulster mounted a coordinated and highly effective campaign against English forces. For nearly a decade, O'Neill held the crown at bay, employing modern military techniques, drawing on Spanish support, and uniting Gaelic Ireland as no leader had done since Brian Boru. His victory at the Battle of the Yellow Ford in 1598 represented the greatest defeat of English forces in Ireland during the entire Tudor period. Nicholas Canny is an Irish historian and academic specialising in early modern Irish history. He has been a lecturer in Irish history at the University of Galway since 1972 and professor there from 1979 to 2011. He is Emeritus Professor of History, University of Galway. He captures the magnitude of the conflict. The 9 Years' War was no mere rebellion, but a national struggle in which the resources of Gaelic Ireland were mobilised to preserve independence against the most powerful monarchy in Europe. Its outcome determined not only the fate of Ireland, but also the trajectory of English imperial ambitions. The turning point came with the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, where the combined forces of O'Neill, O'Donnell and their Spanish allies were decisively defeated. O'Neill submitted in 1603, just after Elizabeth's death, marking the effective completion of the Tudor Conquest. The Conquest not only crushed resistance, but dismantled the structures of Gaelic society. The traditional power of lords, based on kinship, tribute, and martial prestige, was supplanted by English administrative, legal, and military institutions. Robin Frame notes, the Tudor conquest represented not simply the defeat of rebels, but the destruction of a political culture. The Gaelic system of lordship, with its fluidity of succession and emphasis on kin-based legitimacy, was rendered obsolete in the face of English primogeniture, statute law, and centralised authority. The collapse of the great Gaelic dynasties marked the end of Ireland's medieval era. What emerged was an Ireland forcibly integrated into the Tudor state, its culture under siege, and its land increasingly opened to colonisation. The century between 1536 and 1603 witnessed the most radical transformation in Irish history since the coming of Christianity. The fall of the Fitzgeralds, the imposition of the Crown's authority, the suppression of monasteries, and the conquest of Gaelic lordship reshaped the island's political and cultural order. Religious division deepened the rupture, as England sought to impose Protestantism upon a Catholic population. The brutality of the Elizabethan Wars and the devastation of the 9 Years' War underscored the determination of the Tudor monarchy to complete the conquest at all costs. As Jane Ohlmeyer has reflected, the Tudor conquest of Ireland was not merely an extension of royal authority, but the laboratory of English imperialism. Here, for the first time, the methods of conquest, colonization, and cultural suppression were tested, methods that would later be exported across the globe. With the submission of Hugh O'Neill in 1603, Ireland entered a new chapter, no longer a land of autonomous lords, but a kingdom bound to England. Yet the conquest did not erase memory or identity. The resilience of Gaelic tradition and Catholic faith ensured that the struggle for Ireland's autonomy would continue long beyond the Tudors. Ireland's medieval story is one of fire and faith, conquest and survival. From the druids of the Iron Age to the rise of Christianity, from the fury of Viking raids to the iron grip of Norman lords, and finally to the age of rebellion and empire, the island was forever changed. Yet through centuries of chaos, the Irish spirit endured. But Ireland's tale is only one chapter in the wider epic of Europe's Middle Ages. To truly understand this world, you must look beyond the Irish shores. Journey east to England, where warlords and kings fought to forge a single kingdom from the ruins of Rome. Watch the complete history of Anglo-Saxon England and uncover the saga of a land torn by invaders, yet destined for unification. Or travel south to the Iberian Peninsula, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews shaped one of the most dramatic crossroads of medieval history. In The Epic History of Medieval Spain, explained, witness the rise and fall of empires, the clash of civilizations, and the birth of a new world. The story of medieval Europe is vast, brutal, and inspiring. Ireland is only the beginning.